There is a wooden storage box on the third shelf of basement storage room 14 at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. It has been there since 2003. The box is labeled with a handwritten reference number, EDF 78J, which corresponds to a field survey conducted at the Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt nearly half a century ago. Most people who have worked in that building would not recognize the reference. Most would not think to open the box. But hidden inside it is something that shouldn't exist. Not a myth, not a metaphor. Inside that box are 12 plaster casts of wall reliefs from the innermost chamber of the Temple of Edfu. Each cast shows the same shape, a long, narrow handle, bifurcating at the top into two symmetrical prongs, identical in proportion, repeated across different walls, different columns, different register bands. Scholars who saw them in 1978 logged them as ritual sistrum imagery, a type of Egyptian musical rattle used in religious ceremony. Case closed. The casts went into storage, and the walls of Edfu's inner sanctum kept their silence. But in 2003, a research associate attached to a Franco-Egyptian acoustic survey team opened the box. And what she measured that afternoon, using a set of calibrated calipers and a conversion table for the ancient Egyptian royal cubit, stopped the survey in its tracks. If you haven't seen this story before, it's because most of it was never published. And if you want to follow this investigation all the way to the end, subscribe now. Because what we're about to walk through is one of the most quietly suppressed archaeological anomalies of the last 30 years. The Temple of Horus at Edfu is one of the best preserved ancient Egyptian temples on the planet. Construction began in 237 BCE under Ptolemy III and was completed over a period of nearly 2 centuries. But the temple was not built on empty ground. It was constructed directly over a much older sacred site, one that Egyptian records describe as dating back to the primeval age, the time of the gods themselves. The Ptolemaic architects were not inventing. They were preserving something far older. The innermost chamber, the naos, the Holy of Holies, sits at the absolute heart of the structure. It is a rectangular room approximately 3.9 meters wide and 6.1 meters long, carved from a single monolithic block of black granite. No windows, no direct ventilation. Access was restricted even in antiquity to the highest priests, who entered through a single doorway less than a meter wide. On its 4 walls, carved in deep relief and coated in copper-rich pigments, are 64 identical fork-shaped symbols arranged in rows of 8. Here's where it gets strange. When the 2003 survey team measured the fork symbols using the royal cubit, the standard unit of ancient Egyptian measurement, equal to 52.4 centimeters, they found something that had been staring at researchers since 1978. The ratio of the tine length to the tine separation for the fork reliefs was not arbitrary. It was not decorative. The proportions, when converted to vibration frequencies using established physics of vibrating rods, produced a dominant resonance value of 110.7 hertz. 110 hertz. That number matters because in the previous 15 years, archaeoacousticians had been measuring the resonance frequencies of sacred chambers across the ancient world, megalithic sites in Ireland, underground chambers in Malta, ceremonial stone galleries in Peru. And the number that kept appearing, with a consistency that no one could explain, was 110 hertz. Not similar, not inspired by it, the same. The carved forks at Edfu were not just decorative instruments. They were tuning references. Each one encoded the precise vibrational frequency at which the granite chamber was designed to resonate. Now let's slow down and walk through the evidence systematically, because there are 3 specific clues embedded in those carvings, and each one takes us somewhere different. The first clue is the spacing system. When you map the 64 fork carvings across the 4 walls of the naos, they are not randomly distributed. They are organized in a grid of 8 columns and 8 rows, a structure immediately recognizable to acoustic engineers as an 8x8 diffusion matrix. This is a type of surface design used in modern recording studios and concert halls to scatter sound waves and prevent standing waves, destructive echoes that bounce back and cancel out the primary signal. The ancient Egyptians had no known word for standing wave, but their builders appear to have solved the problem using the same mathematical principle that acoustic engineers independently derived in the 20th century. The formula is known as a quadratic residue diffuser. It was first formally described in modern physics by Manfred Schroeder in 1975. For decades, scholars dismissed the grid arrangement as symbolic. Then, modern science found something that changed everything. In 2019, a computational acoustic analysis examining ancient Egyptian temple chambers found that wall surface geometries, including carved relief patterns, functioned as passive diffusers, reducing standing wave interference and extending low-frequency reverberation. The Edfu naos was not specifically included in that study, but its geometric dimensions and surface area fall precisely within the parameters the researchers identified as characteristic of intentional acoustic design. The second clue is in the material. The carvings themselves were not simply painted. X-ray fluorescence analysis conducted by the Cairo Antiquities Authority in 2011 on a small section of accessible wall surface near the doorway found that the pigment filling the engraved fork shapes was not standard Egyptian blue or ochre. It was a copper sulfide compound, a mixture that, when applied to carved stone in thin layers, carries measurable acoustic absorption properties at specific frequencies. Copper, by its mass and density characteristics, is particularly effective as an acoustic treatment material in the low frequency range. At 110 hertz, it performs exceptionally. The priests were not decorating the chamber. They were lining it. The third clue is the geometry of the room itself. When you input the dimensions of the Edfu naos, 3.9 meters wide, 6.1 meters long, approximately 5.4 meters high, into a standard room acoustics calculator and solve for the primary resonance frequency of the space. The answer is 109.8 hertz. The chamber, by its physical dimensions alone, naturally resonates at approximately 110 hertz. The copper fork carvings, by their proportions, encode 110 hertz. The 8x8 diffusion matrix on the walls manages the acoustic behavior of sound at that frequency. Every element of the room points to the same number. They weren't guessing, they were recording. The question is, recording what and why? Because Edfu is not alone. At Chavín de Huántar in the north-central highlands of Peru, a ceremonial complex more than 3,000 years old contains an extraordinary network of underground stone galleries. Research led by the Stanford University Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics, conducted across multiple field seasons beginning in 2001, found that the galleries were deliberately engineered for acoustic effect. The primary frequency range excited by the site's ritual conch shell trumpets, two of which were excavated directly from the complex, produces resonance patterns in exactly the 95 to 120 hertz range. The galleries were not random tunnels. They were tuned spaces, designed to disorient the senses and channel sound in ways that should not have been possible in 900 BCE. At the Ħal Saflieni Hypogeum in Malta, a Neolithic underground complex carved from solid limestone approximately 5,000 years ago. Acoustic measurements published by researchers Watson and Keating found a primary resonance frequency in the oracle room of 114 hertz. A follow-up study, published in the Journal of Archaeological Science, used wave equation modeling incorporating only the room's geometry to reproduce the acoustic peaks computationally. The result confirmed that the chamber's shape alone produces that resonance. The builders of the hypogeum did not need instruments to tune the room. They needed the room itself to be the instrument. At Newgrange in Ireland, at the Passage Tomb Complex at Brúna Bhuin, Acoustic surveys have identified resonance peaks at 110 hertz within the burial chamber passages. The stones have not moved. The geometry has not changed. The frequency is still there, waiting 5,000 years after the last person stood inside and spoke. What we are looking at is not a coincidence of natural cave acoustics. We are looking at a global pattern of intentional acoustic engineering, converging on a single specific frequency. And at Edfu, someone carved the specifications into the walls in copper, arranged them in a mathematical grid, inside a sealed granite chamber, and then closed the door. Here's where the story gets harder to follow. The 2003 acoustic survey at Edfu that first identified the tuning fork dimensions was led by a French archaeoacoustician attached to the Institut National d'Histoire de l'Art in Paris. She filed a preliminary report with the Egyptian Supreme Council of Antiquities in December of that year. The report noted the fork measurement findings, the acoustic properties of the naos, and proposed a follow-up study involving portable acoustic sensors and full photogrammetric documentation of the wall surfaces. The follow-up study was approved. It was never conducted. Access to the innermost naos of Edfu was restricted in early 2005 as part of a conservation initiative. The restriction was listed as temporary. It remains in place as of the time of this writing. The preliminary report was not published in any peer-reviewed journal. Subsequent research by the lead archaeoacoustician referenced the measurements obliquely in a 2007 conference presentation in Marseille, without naming the site. After 2009, her name no longer appears in the archaeological conference literature on Egyptian sites. It was sealed, it was mapped, and then it disappeared. Now, to be clear, there are mundane explanations for all of this. Restrictions on sacred sites are common and often legitimate. Researchers change focus, retire, move to other projects. Not every unpublished preliminary finding represents a deliberate suppression. It is entirely possible that the copper fork measurements were reviewed, found to fall within normal parameters for decorative Egyptian relief work, and quietly filed as a non-result. These things happen in archaeology more often than the public realizes. But that explanation has a problem. The copper sulfide compound, identified by XRF analysis in 2011, does not match any known decorative compound used in Ptolemaic temple construction. The Egyptian blue and red ochre used throughout the Edfu complex, on ceilings, outer walls, and columns, is well documented and chemically consistent across the site. The copper compound in the fork reliefs is not. It appears nowhere else in the temple. It appears only on the 64 fork shapes in the naos. If it was a decorative choice, it was a very specific, very unusual, very isolated one. And if it was functional, if those surfaces were deliberately coated with copper sulfide to manage acoustic absorption at 110 hertz, then the Temple of Edfu contains the oldest known engineered acoustic treatment system in the world, older than any known concert hall, older than any known theater, older than the Roman amphitheaters, which are still celebrated for their acoustic sophistication, older than the Greek theaters at Epidaurus and Priene, whose standing wave management was considered remarkable even by modern engineers. And if that's true, it means our history is missing a chapter, because the Ptolemaic builders of Edfu were not inventors, they were inheritors. They did not design the naos from scratch. They built their temple over an older sacred site and preserved the specifications of its innermost chamber. The 64 copper fork carvings predate the Ptolemaic dynasty. What they copied, and from where, has never been officially investigated. The ancient Egyptian inscriptions associated with the Edfu complex include what scholars call the Edfu building texts, a series of carved records describing the original construction of the sacred site in what sounds like mythological language. They speak of a time before the Great Flood. They describe the first sacred enclosure as a place built by beings who came before the gods of Egypt. Entities described only as the Shedti the divine craftsman of the primeval age. The texts say the first temple was built according to a divine plan preserved on a sacred document brought from the east, and that its innermost chamber was designed so that the gods could be heard. For decades, scholars dismissed this as symbolic, a creation myth, divine rhetoric reserved for temples that wanted to claim ancient authority. But what if allowing the gods to be heard was not metaphor? What if it was a technical description? Because neurological research has now documented what happens to the human brain at exactly 110 hertz. Activity in the left temporal region drops significantly. The pattern of asymmetric brain activity shifts from left hemisphere dominance, the hemisphere associated with language, logic, and analysis, to right hemisphere dominance. The subjective experience reported in controlled studies includes a sense of presence, of external voice, of something speaking that cannot be identified. The priests stood inside a copper-lined granite box, tuned to resonate at the frequency of the human male chant, built according to a mathematical grid that managed the sound waves. And they chanted. And the room spoke back, not the voice of a god in any supernatural sense, the voice of the room itself. The voice of physics, bent deliberately by engineers who understood it well enough to encode its specifications in copper, in stone, in a grid of 8 by 8, and then seal it behind a door less than a meter wide, and leave it for 45 centuries. The plaster casts are still in basement storage room 14 at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. The naos of the Temple of Edfu is still closed to outside researchers. The copper sulfide compound has not been reanalyzed. No full acoustic measurement of the chamber has been published. The walls stand in their original granite geometry, in their original proportions, still holding, if anyone were ever allowed to measure them properly, a resonance signature of approximately 110 hertz. And somewhere else in the world, in a stone gallery in Peru, in a limestone chamber in Malta, in a river-facing tomb in Ireland, other builders who should have had no contact with each other, no shared language, no known mechanism of exchange, carved their own chambers to the same specification, left their own acoustic signatures, pointed at the same frequency across thousands of years and thousands of miles. The question that no official body has formally asked, and that no institution has formally funded an answer to, is simple. Who taught them all? Was it independent convergence, the same solution arrived at separately? Was it a shared knowledge system we have not yet identified? Was it something older than any civilization we currently acknowledge? Something that left its blueprint in copper and stone on the walls of rooms that were never meant to be fully understood by the people who inherited them. That box has been on the shelf in room 14 for more than 20 years. Nobody has opened it twice. If this investigation cracked something open for you, hit like, subscribe, and share it with someone who still believes we know the full story of the ancient world. And when you're ready for the next step, the video waiting for you now covers the hidden acoustic chambers detected beneath the western galleries of Angkor Wat, where ground-penetrating radar in 2018 found a sealed stone room that does not appear on any official excavation map. The door is still there. Nobody has gone in.